Anti-immigrant sentiment in South Africa is no longer simply brewing beneath the surface of our politics. It has erupted into a powerful social and political force that is already reshaping how South Africa is perceived, both across the continent and internationally. Yet for all the attention being given to the protests, the raids, the social media campaigns, and the political posturing surrounding immigration, there's been remarkably little serious discussion about the longer-term consequences of the forces that have now been set in motion. Instead, much of our political class appears to be doing something else. Faced with growing public frustration, they have chosen to accommodate and validate these sentiments rather than confront the dangers they pose. They've sought to manage the mobilization rather than explain its implications. That is unfortunate because the risks extend far beyond immigration policy itself. This is not simply a debate about who should be allowed to enter South Africa. Nor is it simply a debate about border control, crime, unemployment, or public services, however important these issues may be. It is increasingly becoming a debate about South Africa's place in Africa, South Africa's position in the world, and whether we fully understand what is being sacrificed in the name of solving problems that ridding the country of immigrants, whether legal or illegal, cannot actually solve. Because the uncomfortable reality is this: South Africa is currently engaged in a process of weakening one of the greatest strategic assets it has. And the consequences of that may prove far more significant than many people currently realize. We are in danger of making a very serious strategic miscalculation, one that will have consequences far beyond the sporadic eruptions of anti-immigrant sentiment and xenophobia that have flared up over the past 2 decades. Recently, a graphic has been circulating widely on South African social media. It highlights the lack of support and even persecution the ANC experienced in exile by fellow African countries in its fight against apartheid. It argues that South Africans should remember how badly African countries treated ANC exiles during apartheid before referring to other Africans as our brothers and sisters. The implication is straightforward. South Africans owe little to the rest of Africa because support for the liberation struggle was conditional, limited, or self-interested. Now, whether those claims are historically accurate or not is not actually the question I want to address. Because even if every claim in that graphic were true, the strategic question would remain exactly the same. Who benefits when South Africa becomes increasingly isolated from the rest of Africa? Because that is where this politics is leading us. And the damage it is doing to South Africa's long-term strategic position is staggering. One of the most persistent misconceptions in South African politics is that our influence comes primarily from our relatively well-developed economy, business sector, and modern state, our military, our infrastructure, and our skills and intellectual capital. These things do matter. That is indisputable. But for much of the democratic era, South Africa's greatest source of influence has been something far less obvious. It's been our ability to act as a continental convener. South Africa occupies a unique position on the continent. We have often been able to build relationships across Africa, mediate disputes, attract investment, facilitate dialogue, and act as a bridge between Africa and the wider world. That position is extraordinarily valuable, but it depends upon legitimacy. A country cannot claim continental leadership while treating fellow Africans as intruders. Every xenophobic attack, every anti-immigrant mobilization, every politician who discovers that African, Indian, Bangladeshi, and Pakistani migrants make convenient political scapegoats, all of these things gradually erode South Africa's influence on the continent. And legitimacy, once lost, is not easily regained. Many South Africans view our relationship with Africa primarily through the lens of history. They ask what Africa did for us, what other countries supported the ANC, whether that support was sufficient, whether we owe anyone anything. But that is to ask precisely the wrong question. The question is not one of transactionalism. The issue is not simply historical obligation. The greater issue at play here is South Africa's strategic power. Since 1994, South African firms have expanded throughout the continent. Banks, retailers, telecommunications companies, mining houses, logistics firms. These relationships have generated markets, investment opportunities, revenue streams, and political connections extending far beyond our borders. And in an increasingly uncertain world, those relationships matter. One reason South Africa weathered the 2008 global financial crisis better than many observers expected was that we were not solely dependent on developments within our own borders or economic partners across the globe. We possessed broader continental linkages on the African continent. Those networks broadened South Africa's options and made us more resilient to global shocks. Simply put, options matter, particularly during periods of global instability. That is why I describe South Africa's relationship with Africa as a form of strategic capital. Not charity, not sentiment, not historical repayment, strategic capital. And strategic capital can be lost. Governments across Africa are already facing pressure to respond to anti-African immigrant sentiment in South Africa. Some have threatened retaliation. Some have imposed restrictions on South African businesses. Others have begun questioning whether South Africa should continue enjoying privileged access to African markets while simultaneously treating African migrants as unwanted outsiders. That should concern us, because if those relationships deteriorate, South Africa loses far more than investment opportunities. It loses strategic flexibility. And strategic flexibility is precisely what will matter most in the world that is now emerging. The post-Cold War era is over. We are entering a period of intensified competition between major powers: the United States, China, Russia, the European Union, India, and others. In such a world, countries thrive when they possess strategic autonomy. South Africa is unusually well positioned in respect of strategic autonomy. As a member of BRICS, as one of Africa's largest economies, and as one of the few genuinely constitutional democracies within several of the geopolitical groupings to which it belongs, South Africa possesses something valuable: the ability to act as a bridge, the ability to choose among competing relationships rather than simply to submit to them. But that leverage depends upon our relationship with Africa. A South Africa that becomes estranged from the continent itself ceases to be a bridge. It ceases to be a convener. It ceases to be a meaningful geopolitical actor. Instead, it becomes merely another middle-income country negotiating from weakness in a changing global order where strategic alliances will determine our future. In other words, we move from being a player to becoming one of the played. That is the reality. Whenever a country begins weakening its strategic position, it is worth asking who bears the costs and who remains insulated from them. That brings us to a very uncomfortable question. Who actually benefits from a weaker South Africa? Certainly not the unemployed. Certainly not the workers. Certainly not small business owners. Certainly not communities whose futures remain tied to this country. The people most dependent on South Africa's long-term success are precisely those being encouraged to support policies that weaken its strategic position. Meanwhile, many of those least vulnerable to South Africa's decline belong to what is essentially a comprador and elite class. A globally mobile class whose wealth, assets, and opportunities are increasingly detached from the fate of any single country. Their capital can move. Often they can move with it. Most ordinary South Africans cannot. Their futures remain rooted here, and that creates a profound divergence of interests. The irony is that this process is frequently presented as an assertion of sovereignty. In reality, it does the opposite. It weakens one of the principal foundations of South Africa's ability to act independently in the world, its alliances. And history suggests that this is not uniquely a South African problem. Britain convinced itself that Brexit would restore sovereignty. Instead, it weakened one of the principal sources of British influence and economic resilience, its relationship with the EU. And 14 years of austerity has left it hobbling along alone. And now that it stands alone, even its special friend, the United States, has been putting the squeeze on it under the Trump administration. Britain is experiencing even more anti-immigrant sentiment than ever before because its breakup with the EU and its disastrous policy decisions have heavily impacted the British people. Services that were once taken for granted, such as the National Health Service, are now in crisis, and poverty levels have risen. By 2026, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation reported that poverty in the United Kingdom had not only persisted but deepened. Nearly half of all people living in poverty were now experiencing what the foundation terms very deep poverty, with income substantially below the poverty line. The foundation also noted that the most severe forms of deprivation had increased sharply, with levels of destitution more than doubling between 2017 and 2022. Food insecurity had likewise risen dramatically, with millions more people struggling to access sufficient nutritious food in just a few years. The significance of these findings extends beyond Britain itself. They illustrate an important political reality. The consequences of decisions taken in the name of sovereignty, national renewal, or popular grievance do not always appear immediately. They often accumulate slowly before they eventually manifest as profound social and economic costs borne disproportionately by ordinary citizens. Hungary offers perhaps the other most revealing example in Europe. Viktor Orban built much of his political project around fear of immigration. Yet Hungary was never a major destination for migrants. The threat was largely symbolic, but the politics were effective. This year, the Hungarian people voted Viktor Orban out after 16 years of consecutive presidential terms. Hungary's economy has now entered what analysts describe as a state of stable stagnation. Economic growth has slowed. The country's convergence with more prosperous European economies has stalled. Structural weaknesses have become increasingly visible, and dependence on external sources of capital and support has deepened. The irony is that Orban built his political project around defending Hungarian sovereignty. Yet 16 years later, Hungary is more dependent upon external capital and external support than when he first came to power. The United States has increasingly embraced a politics of exceptionalism, transactionalism, and nationalist withdrawal. Again, the promise was renewed strength. Yet the result has often been greater division, weaker alliances, and diminished international influence. Ordinary US citizens are increasingly being affected by the chaos and uncertainty of the Trump administration's tariff wars, its blatant corruption, its betrayal of long-term allies, and its military misadventures, especially in Iran, which has produced supply chain interruptions across the world. What the consequences of Trump's second term will be are yet to be experienced. But every indication is that the US has already weakened its global position substantially. Its former allies are moving on from it. Its heady cocktail of transactionalism, exceptionalism, and protectionism has worn away at its position as a global hegemon, and it looks as though that process may well be irreversible. The lesson is important. Xenophobia does not need to be grounded in reality to be politically successful, but it can still produce very real costs. South Africa's vulnerability to lapsing into protectionism was identified long ago by Mahmoud Mamdani when he was a professor of African Studies at the University of Cape Town. He very astutely identified what he called South African exceptionalism, the belief that South Africa somehow stands apart from Africa, that our future can be secured independently of the continent to which we belong. This is an attitude that we inherited directly from the apartheid state, and it has no place in our democratic future. Because as a democratic nation, what now sets us apart and gives us competitive leverage and bargaining power on the global stage is precisely the role we've occupied on the African continent as a leading moral, political, and economic power. So retreating into exceptionalism and protectionism is not a strategy for renewal. It is a recipe for decline, which brings me back to the title of this video, Putting South Africa Last, because that is ultimately what anti-immigrant and xenophobic politics does. It encourages South Africans to dismantle one of the greatest sources of strategic strength, its membership to and leadership role on the African continent. It asks citizens whose futures remain tied to this country to participate in willingly weakening South Africa's influence, reducing its options, and narrowing its room for leverage, constraining its power, all of this in an increasingly competitive global environment. Anti-immigration agendas and xenophobia is often presented as patriotism, but patriotism strengthens the country. These agendas weaken it. In simple terms, these agendas are not patriotism. They constitute an ill-advised exercise in national self-harm. It is a gift to our enemies, because our enemies know that we are weak when we stand alone, having burnt our bridges with the continent that we belong to. And that is why it is, quite literally, putting South Africa last. Thank you. Click the like and subscribe button if you'd like more people to get this video on their feeds.